thank you so much for all being here. We're going to come with our last panel presentation today. We have a nice little catchy title, Deal Making in the Registered Investment Advisor Space. And joining me today are my two wonderful colleagues, Shelbie Harvey, who, there she is right up there. Poor Shelbie has experienced firsthand the air traffic control situation, has had, what was it, half a dozen flights canceled, Shelbie? At least, you know. Yeah. We can't, can you hear us? Oops. Uh-oh.
Can you hear me? Is that better?
I got you.
Okay, there you go. Yep, that sounds right. Ernie spent a good bit of the day on Saturday at the airport trying to figure out how to get there and ultimately wasn't able to make it work. So here we are.
Here we are. So at least, you know, like Danielle, we were adjusted. And I asked her to join us because, you know, she was in-house and she'll be able to comment on what Shelbie and I have to say. It's interesting. When we were putting together this program, we wanted to make sure that we really spent a good fair amount of time talking about this. As I said to you at the very beginning, at the opening, you know, one of the things that we're seeing now, especially in our space, you know, the types of spaces where you are operating as registered investment advisors, we have found people are beginning to think, what should I do? They certainly don't want to leave their jobs, and no one here is suggesting that they should. But what happens? You know, what happens if A, B, and C happens? And great, perfect. We just got a sound check. Lee says everything sounds great. So we're really happy that we can talk about this. But just like the other two panels were interactive and they did such an amazing job, all the panelists and everything, we want this to be just as interactive because we think that this is really going to be the real personal issues that you're dealing with on a daily basis and that you're thinking about in terms of your future planning and everything. Now, I do want to say one thing. No one is obligated to say anything, but by all means, please say something. And again, like I said at the very beginning of our sessions here today, you can certainly change the names to protect the innocent. But we are here today to talk about these particular issues. So I want to mention one of the dominating things that's occurring in this space is this idea of merger, aggregation, joint venture, shifting to different platforms and things like this. And there are a plethora of things to do. And so I want to turn to Shelbie to talk to us a little bit about, to begin our discussion here today, about the market landscape and what we're seeing in the types of quote unquote deals that are happening in this particular space. Shelbie, I apologize. We apologize for looking at our back.
Yeah, no problem. So Ernie, do you mean that the various kind of flavors these transactions can take the shape of?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll go to this slide here. So we see these transactions take on a number of flavors and shapes. Primarily, they're either an asset or an equity transaction. An asset transaction, I like to describe this as a kind of primary M&A lawyer. An asset deal would be where a buyer came in and bought all the stuff outside the inside of the house. The equity deal would be the buyer bought the house. And so there are various, you know, reasons for why one may be favored over another. In this space, it's either tax driven. Sometimes an asset deal is more favorable to a buyer because they can cherry pick liabilities and kind of reduce their legacy risk there. Another reason for why an asset deal would be disfavored in a traditional M&A context would be because sort of the retitling of assets and assignment of contracts can become kind of cumbersome. But as our colleagues talked about earlier in the first presentation, the client consent process is going to be relatively similar regardless of whether it's an asset purchase or an equity purchase. So that's sort of a less significant reason for why you choose one versus another. So these deals can be 100% purchase the assets or the equity, or it could be something less than that, where a buyer would come in and purchase a minority investment, or the flip of it, where the buyer would buy the entire business, but the seller could retain a certain percentage or roll over equity into the buyer's existing structure. And these deals kind of different from structure, there are some key features these deals often present with. Most often they've got some element of upfront purchase price, a cash upfront purchase price, and then some deferred consideration either through a seller note or an earnout. And then another kind of key pattern we're seeing in the market are the platform acquisitions with the following add-on and tuck-in transactions that happen thereafter. So we see these big PE-backed buyers, buying a large RIA and then use that large RIA as the platform for adding on smaller advisors, whether that's to achieve like a new geographic market or a new niche, like for example, professional sports athletes or something like that. And then tuck-ins are more like, a buyer's looking for certain technology or some sort of add-in to the existing platform that kind of smaller acquisition would bring.
And I think what Shelbie's pointing out, and the reason why I wanted to begin that sort of way, is to give you the panoply of how you should consider this. We're not here recommending for even a moment one over the other. This is really driven by you as the RIA, as the professional, as to how you want to continue to work, or whether you want to work at all. Whether you just want to say, okay, you want to monetize your assets and everything. And so you were in-house.
I was going to say I was actually in-house during a merger or an acquisition. So I was at a wealth management firm, and they've been in the business for 20 plus years, and I think they wanted to slow down and sort of exit as well. And so what they did was, there was a purchase. So Hightower, it's public information, publicly disclosed, had purchased this wealth management firm. And what Hightower's business model is that they purchase a bunch of investment firms and they let them run individually as they've been running. However, they provide all the back office support. So it's a centralized back office that has acquired, again, these smaller investment management firms that are then able to continue to run on their own.
Yeah, it's funny. The more things change, the more they stay the same. When I first started practicing, we used to call them independents. Independent broker dealers, independent investment advisors, who then would do the back office compliance. But the business model has slightly changed, and that raises issues. No matter how you decide or what you decide. One of the things, as you heard from some of our panelists before, especially our first panel, when they were talking about the regulatory and compliance issues, I always like to tell clients when they get in this space, because I am the dark green club, I will always tell people the worst case scenario to prepare them for it, is remember, whether it be the SEC or the state, they could say no. And so that means you have to prepare for the process, okay? It's not just, and I know this is a lot throwing at everybody right now, it's not just finding a way forward, okay? It's how are the regulators going to respond, okay? Now, one of the things that if it's a sale, of course, the regulators will respond accordingly and will make a decision about whether they think that transaction is appropriate. Primarily focusing in on what we talked about on our first panel about whether the clients have agreed to this quote unquote assignment in some way. Okay. But there's more to that. For example, one of the things that regulators will look at is they'll look at both the buyer and the seller, whether there's going to be an appropriate transition, whether that is going to be in place, whether, customers are going to get lost in the shuffle. They're going to be very concerned about that. And I have seen questions coming from various states and the SEC staff on this particular issue, okay? Because it's not just, looking at it from a percentage of like dollars and cents, okay? So they're going to be looking at it from that perspective. And they're also going to be looking upon the transition, whether it's going to be seamless or not, or as best seamless as possible. And I will tell you, I've had questions come up even when the custodian doesn't change. Shockingly, it's like I've had that before. One of the things that will come up is, when was the last time you updated your customer account agreement? You'll have things like that. There'll be requirements about that will go into it that you wouldn't have expected. And then, of course, the mechanics that go into it, the changes to the Form ADV, okay? I have a cousin who's retired from the IRS. He graduated college, got his CPA, went to work for the IRS, was a supervisor, put in his time there. And I always joke with him, that the IRS could care less about, raising money for the U.S. government. The only thing that they care about is the proper form being filed. And he never admits it, never denies it, just smiles when I say it, okay? And that's exactly the situation in our area as well, too. The regulators are looking to make sure that the proper forms have been filed, the proper disclosures have been made. I know there was a question earlier today about accuracy and everything, and a discussion about that. They are looking for those to be accurate. They're looking for them to make sure that what is being disclosed to the public, both in the Part 1, the Part 2, the business continuity plans, the disclosures that go, the BCPs, that go to customers, they want that to be there. They want that to be there. And like when you were in your turmoil, transition, what did you see?
So I was going to say with us, I think, transition was really important, especially because it was a high touch wealth management firm. And so we kept a lot of the personnel. That was, I think, what's really important, and had a lot of the personnel, although they became employees of the new advisor, they were still around, and that was part of the succession plan, and that was also part of the acquisition, to keep this sort of transition as smooth as possible. So,
now we want to transition. Now we're going to oh yes, David.
Just a question. Yeah. So you mentioned that there was an aggregation of smaller independents. Do they keep the names the same to be less disruptive to the clients?
It's interesting. It's a great question. Yes, they did. So long story short, so it's all under, for example, Hightower, which is the investment advisor firm. That's the registered firm with the SEC. However, they've each individually kept their boutique names.
Now we want to transition to a slightly different topic, because it's something we've been seeing. And Shelbie is going to talk about and discuss with us the private equity buyers that we're seeing, what the issues that pop up with that, because that is a different way of looking at how this business has operated in the past, primarily because private equity firms have a lot of the cash in our economy right now, and they're looking to spend. Shelbie?
Yeah, so there are a number of reasons why a seller may or may not want to take on PE money. And as I said before, it can come in 100% or just in part. And so the considerations depend on whether or not it's an all or nothing. But so some pros, of course, would be PE money gets you access to better infrastructure, back office services, potentially equity incentives for your key talent that you may not be able to provide as an independent. And as much as this is all sort of succession planning focused, a lot of smaller RIAs are looking to grow themselves. And so PE money gives them the ability to take that money and start acquiring its growth capital for them. But, depending on the personality of the particular advisor, it may not be a good idea, especially if the PE is going to exercise a lot of control over the governance after closing. There's performance pressure and potentially, friction issues between that advisor and this new kind of regime over what it had been their, business that they were able to freely run. So it's really just driven based on what the advisor's objectives are in the long term and what kind of control they're willing to tolerate from a PE who comes in.
Yeah, and look, Shelbie hits on a great point, and that is this is a different way of doing business than what you normally would be doing. Now, again, we're not recommending any approach one way or another. It's all personal. And candidly, we've had some clients who we've discussed these issues with who are all gung-ho to, do something with their practice, merge or what have you, who decided after kicking the tires a little bit, no, I'm going to stay the way I am right now. I'm not going to do anything new. I'm not going to do anything, sort of radical. I'm not going to do anything radical, which is completely fine too. There's nothing wrong with that. But part of what we want to make sure you're aware of too is if you do decide to go down that route in terms of merging, aggregating, joint venture, whatever that may be, acquiring even. One of the things that you may want to consider is some of the regulatory and compliance considerations. You know, we've already talked a little bit about the successor registration and the Form ADVs. You know, one of the things that Zahir was talking about with her old firm, you know, about how they were continuing to operate under their old sort of brand name, but, you know, under the Hightower investment advisor. What happens to that old investment advisor? You know, what happens to it? I always like to tell people, I always ask that question, and I truly agree that when I ask that question, okay, I sound like a used car salesman. Because as many people who are thinking about this in this sort of category to like sort of do something else to a different way, there are other people who are looking to purchase investment advisors. And so I always say that it's like, don't think for a moment that, you know, that you're going to have to necessarily close it, you know, file a Form ADVW. You know, you can in fact sell it. Someone may want to buy it. And, you know, that's a value, that's an asset to also consider as well, too. And
I think these aggregators are definitely becoming more and more common where they're providing back office services, especially for folks who want to wind down. And so, you know, they can just manage assets and manage their clients while slowly sort of transitioning off.
Exactly. I thought if someone, by the way, if someone has a question,
I actually do.
Sure, go ahead.
If you were looking at an aggregator, what questions would you ask if you were a seller?
It's the same questions I would ask for any new situation. Okay. When you're talking about with an aggregator, you're looking at a number of different things. You're looking at control, you're looking at finances, and you're looking at end result. Okay. Meaning that in control and end result are sort of like, you know, two sides, different sides of the same coin. But the financial aspect to it goes both ways as well, too. For example, are you going to an aggregator that has the capital to support you? Okay. That is not some, and we have seen this. There are some aggregators out there who are better than others. You know, let's just be honest about it. And that part of that financing aspect to it is, what are they going to pay you? You know, what are they going to pay you? What is your compensation going to be? You know, I joke, I teach at a couple of local law schools, and I teach in this area, securities. And I always joke with them, you know, I am a capitalist, you know, and like, I understand that we're out here to make money. And, you know, I put no shame on anybody who does. And, you know, I think I tell my clients all the time, you have every right. You've built this business. You've built this opportunity now, and you should cash in on it if that's what you want. If that's what you want. And, you know, we're trying really hard not to push one thing over the other. You know, so I think that's important to keep in mind. And then finally, what's the end result going to be? And this goes back to asking yourself the question, what do you want to do? Do you want to continue to be business as usual? And so here talked about like the situation where in a situation like that with an aggregator, you could have business as usual. But I know others where it is not business as usual. You have to conform. They're paying you. You have to conform to the way they want to do the business. So it's really, those are the questions you want to ask. But more importantly, you have to be comfortable in knowing what you want from the end result. So you do that.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly that. I think it just depends on what the individuals who are running the business, own the business, really want at the end of the day. You know, what I've seen it with folks as they're getting older, wanting to slow down, but still loving what they do. And so they're just trying to offload all of this back office, you know, nonsense in their minds,
Yes.
Such as compliance and accounting, you know, all back office accounting. But they still want to, you know, stay in the game, you know, and as long as they can. And so I think that, you know, joining, you know, selling to an aggregator really allows folks to do that.
Yep. Question.
So I'm asking this for a friend.
Yes.
I'm kidding. No. You see a lot of these deals. As a practical matter, how many suitors you need to talk with before you get comfortable?
I'm going to start with Shelbie. Shelbie, what's your answer to that? And then Sahir and I will also jump in too.
Yeah, so I mean, I hear from clients that they get many phone calls from folks interested in buying their business. And so we say, like, keep operating your business as you are. You're likely to attract the right buyer for you. I can't give a set number, but I think, once you've had a fair number of outreach in your direction, you've got the opportunity to kind of analyze what the terms may be as between each potential option and can kind of get an idea of which direction you want to go. I don't think there's a set 5, or I couldn't give it a number, but I do think there is value in evaluating various options and try to figure out which one might be most aligned for you and your objectives. Ernie, Sahir, do you have other thoughts on that?
No, I just have an interesting story. So again, I was, in-house at Bel Air Investment Advisor, wealth management firm in Los Angeles. And it was started by 3 guys from Goldman Sachs who decided to go into the private wealth, start their own business. So they did, called it Bel Air Investment Advisors. State Street came around, bought it, tried to run it for about a year or 2, couldn't, sold it back on pennies to the same original sellers. Kept doing their thing, monopolizing a lot of the, Hollywood money. And then when I was there, it was just purchased by Fiera, which is a Canadian public bank. They couldn't run it. They tried for a couple years. They sold it back to the same folks who had purchased it, who had sold it initially, same 3 guys. And now it's with Hightower. And I think, those 3 gentlemen are enjoying not having to deal with all the back office stuff, but they've made a good, pretty dime on their business.
Yeah.
So 3 times,
Yeah.
same business.
And I think the learning lesson there is that these businesses are so focused on the personnel and their relationships with the client. And so you're going to want to find a buyer that's going to allow you to keep your client focused mentality. And that will, give you the best long-term result. It seems like the folks in Sahir's story didn't quite, follow that motto. But if you can find a buyer who's going to keep your clients at the forefront, that's a win.
And I think you have a lot of negotiating power, really, as a seller.
Yeah.
So.
And I will add this too. I do get phone calls from clients sometimes where they're saying, nobody's interested in my business. And then we start to talk. And then I go, but you told me 2 weeks ago that so-and-so called you. Oh, yeah, that's right. And then didn't someone else call you too? Oh, yeah, they called too, And and by the time the conversation, a 10-minute conversation is over, we've talked about a half a dozen suitors have called this particular client. And I chuckle because what I say to the client is, what that tells me is, it's not that there's no interest in your business. You don't have an interest in who's coming to you, which is fine. You don't have to, you're not going to find your true love, right away. You know what I'm saying? It may take some time, that's the way it is. It's just like, I think that's sort of like what you're looking at. I shouldn't put love in the category in this situation, but I think you get my point on that. Now, one thing I do want to mention when we're going through these compliance issues and getting ready and like talking about this is it's a wonderful opportunity for me to pontificate on why and how and the wherefore as to how you should get your documents in play. Okay. That is your compliance manuals, your policies, your P&Ls, okay? Making sure your audits are all up to snuff, okay? Making sure that all your filings, your Form ADVs, both on the advisor level and the advisor, the individual advisors are all appropriate. Making sure that your businesses are all aligned with investment advisory work. Making sure you've been in contact with your clients and that you just haven't forgotten about them. I know everybody here, that's perfect for everybody. I know it is, okay? But a lot of times that's not perfect. I represented people, it's a one-person shop. I remember this one person I represented, he actually is kind of interesting. His office was in the town next to mine. And he had about $10 million under management. This was about 20 years ago. $10 million under management for the last 40 years. Okay. But it generated a wonderful income for him. And we started to talk. And I said to him, I go, so how is the investment advisor structure. He goes, what are you talking about? I'm the investment advisor. It was a DBA. There was no corporate structure around it, no LLC, no holding company, nothing like that. And, you know, I go, and you've never been sued? No, why would I get sued? You know, just like, these are some of the questions, you know, have you ever, and then just another story, and then we'll move on to another topic. I once represented an investment advisor who was actually an investment advisor in the private equity space, okay? And I formed his investment advisor. Wonderful guy. But we were going through the process, and for those who've gone through the investment advisor process, I think you know it's not fun. The application process, it's like a Sarah and I just went through it, so we know it's a proctology examination. Let's be honest about it, okay? And I'll never forget going through this. And then we were preparing for that. I think someone said it earlier today, that 6-month exam that comes after you become an investment advisor. And in preparation for that, I told him, I go, make sure you have A, B, and C. And he was fine with most of it. And then I go, you also need to have a customer complaint file. And he lost it on me. He just went off on me. He said, Ernie, have you lost your mind? What are you talking about? Okay. What are you talking about? He goes, you know, I have no retail customers. You know, I'm an investment manager for private equity and hedge funds. Why are you asking such stupid questions? And I go, can you do me a favor? Okay. Can you just please have the file ready? He goes, you know, I'm beginning to question not only your intelligence, Ernie, but your sanity. And by the way, that's a direct quote from my client. Okay. Lo and behold, a couple of months later, the state, it was the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania came in. They came in and they did an examination, okay? First thing they asked him for, let's see your customer complaint file. They come in, it was like a half-a-day examination. It wasn't a big deal, okay? He immediately, he says, you're the first person I'm calling. You're still a blank, but you were right. That was the first thing they asked you for. Some of the things that we share with you and prepare you for, it's only because of what we expect will happen, Sorry for the long war story on that, but that's something that you should be prepared for, you know, and having all of that ready and having all of that prepared. Now, we're going to shift a little bit into risk and diligence. And Shelbie, can you tell us a little bit about, like, you know, the focus and what we should be looking at?
Yeah, so from the buyer's perspective, the financial diligence is going to be the most important. A buyer's going to get a fulsome quality of earnings report. They're going to assess client retention dynamics, your fee schedules, your client concentration. Where are you getting clients from? What's your pipeline? How dependent are you on certain key people? Those sort of things that, you know, what's the business theory of the deal is going to be important. And how likely is there going to be client attrition after closing? Separate from the financial diligence assessment, there'll be a more general risk assessment. For an RIA business is different than, you know, your run-of-the-mill M&A transaction because it's pretty asset light. There aren't forklifts and employee injuries and many things, categories of things you don't need to look into, but there are a number of things that you do. Of course, the compliance elements that we've talked about a lot today are key, but then other things that can come up in any business, employee litigation, real estate leases, those sorts of things will be an element of diligence. And so to the extent a buyer identifies specific risks like active litigation or disputes with a client or something like that, the buyer will affirmatively seek indemnification protection for those known issues in a purchase agreement. So we can talk more about how the indemnification package works later. But I think financial diligence is the most important, and it's going to be what a buyer focuses on. They want to make sure the cash machine is going to continue after closing. And then secondarily, but also important, to make sure there's no sort of risks of loss later because of the seller's poor management of the business prior to acquisition.
And that takes us into perfectly about the compliance due diligence that will occur as well too. You know, not only your procedures, but they're going to be looking at what we talked about in our other panels, you know, privacy and cybersecurity issues. What have the prior exams shown? You know, that's going to be a big issue as well too. You know, that's going to be something that you got to be prepared for and you got to be prepared to answer that as well too. They're going to ask about insurance. I know we spent a lot of time, Kimberly spent a lot of time talking about cyber insurance. They're certainly going to ask about that, but they're going to ask about other forms of insurance as well too, if you have it. And they're going to be looking to see, what potential claims may be out there. Back to the customer complaint file. If you have some issues with customers, they're going to be viewing them as potential litigation. So, that's one of the things that you have to be concerned about. And that leads us pretty well into the next aspect to it, because, the nature of the business, we've talked about this, is assets under management, okay? But what are those assets under management? It's the clients. Our worth, and, even as lawyers, we share the same thing that you share. We're only as good as our clients. We're only as successful as our clients. And, one of the things we've talked about before about assignments and everything, and Shelbie, if you could jump in too, about client retention and how that all works out and what we should be looking for.
Yeah, so a lot of times these deals will be structured as a separate sign and close transaction, which means the purchase agreement will get signed, and then in between the signing and closing process, this client consent retention process will take place. The client contracts will be analyzed, as our colleagues had described earlier, for what the consent requirements are. Is it affirmative? Is there a possibility that a negative consent will work? And then the parties will come together to put together a communication to go out to the clients and focus on the positives of the deal and try to limit client attrition that way. And in the deals that I've done, I see there, as a condition to closing the transaction, a certain number of received consents, a certain percent. And once that's achieved, the deal can move forward to closing. So that's how I see it working from a process perspective.
And always remember, as much as it's an M&A transaction, a corporate transaction, you still have the regulatory component, and you have to align the timing, and you have to be understanding that, you may be able to get that, but before you can move forward, you have to have regulatory approval. So what about like retention? What have you seen with that? How does that seem to work, and what happens?
Yeah, so in terms of like client retention, I think it's really, again, because it was a high touch, firm, really just knowing the clients, speaking with them on one-on-one, telling them what's going on, allowing them to feel like they're part of the process, and really just making them feel like nothing's going to change, especially if a lot of the main investment advisors will stay on during the transition process. I think that's really important for client retention, to keep them secure. And I'm sure, Shelbie, tell me if I'm wrong, but I assume a lot of these deals, there's probably a client retention period where, the folks, the advisors have to stay on and have to ensure that, they're not just going to open up shop across the street and take all the clients with them.
And that's why we're
right.
here, because we're going to move into that now about negotiating the terms of the deal. That's perfect.
I didn't think that.
Yeah, so to your point there, client retention is largely based on personnel retention. And so there are a number of ways to achieve this, but we see, non-competes have been at risk, recently. They aren't as good as they once were. That being said, they do typically hold up in the sale of a business context. So if you've got a individual seller that is getting substantial sale proceeds, you can use a non-compete in the context of sale of the business. You could get it for 5 years or less. But if you've got key personnel who are not on the cap table, not receiving deal proceeds, it's a little bit trickier. You'll want to build in those sorts of restrictive covenants into employment agreements if you can. Those durations are shorter though, so you can, as a condition to closing, require certain individuals enter into employment agreements that, go for a year or 2 years, just to make sure that we keep clients and keep those personnel, plugged in with the clients. But where non-competes fail as to key personnel, in jurisdictions like California, for example, where non-competes for individuals aren't enforceable, the best thing that a buyer can do in that situation is to make sure that those key personnel are getting compensated very well so that they stick around, and it's worth it in the end if it keeps the clients in place.
What kind of retention bonuses do you find typical versus their annual compensation? Like 2x, 0.5?
So it's sort of all over the map. I can't give a specific range. It depends. So yeah, and then you can also use earn-out mechanisms to, kind of protect a buyer from client attrition. So it's not a transaction bonus, but it sort of keeps the everyone focused and rallied around client retention because they want to achieve their full earn-out after closing.
Yeah, and that also goes to, like, for example, Mark, it goes to, like, for example, if you want to transition into retirement, it's the same thing, that you have to stick around for so many years to earn what you're going to get. Mark?
Good to say, James, we have an excellent M&A consultant firm that we utilize that gives data on both earnout and retention by industry. It may not be exact to you, but I can get you that. So that's one. Two, for industry specific BDIA institutions, I have seen scenarios where the acquired entity or company that wants to be acquired was being asked to get to certain numbers as a condition precedent to the sale. But be careful if you're considering personnel to do that. One, because they could be key and important to the operations. And also, if an entity has 50 employees, it can avail itself under a federal rule of a mass transfer, which is a very easy way to transfer all of your people. But this one institution had cut its costs by reducing its headcount number from 57 to 43. And now the cost of doing the compliance transfer of all the people became a one-to-one individual cost, and it doubled their compliance cost. And so the acquirer was less interested. They ultimately found another way to work it out, but just be thoughtful when you're thinking about negotiating the terms of the transfer. And they didn't, we came in after this had happened. But it's much easier and simpler to take advantage, I think it's 1017 now under the new rule, to be able to basically take all of your registered people and put them over into the new entity with the mass transfer, but you have to have at least 50 people to do it.
Yeah, and I think the point that Shelbie and Mark is saying is that there's no cookie cutter. It's like everything is case specific. Yes.
Well, you specifically mentioned earnouts and incentives. Would you have to describe in the Form ADV what the incentives are, and then be clear about the potential conflict as part of the sale?
That's an interesting question. Mark, what have you seen?
I think that you may have to disclose that those are potential terms of the deal, but FINRA there's been guidance that said that is proprietary, and for the exact terms of this proprietary information to the parties, it doesn't have to be disclosed.
Yeah.
So does FINRA apply, or does the SEC rules apply?
Well,
RIA?
SEC, but also keep in mind, we've mentioned FINRA a couple of times for a very important purpose. Who runs the IARD system? It's FINRA.
Right.
So it's like we have to be acknowledge their existence even in the RIA space. So but it's SEC guidance as well.
Yeah, that's right.
SEC guidance as well.
Says it's proprietary and not.
Yes.
The formula.
And that's why these consultants that Mark is talking about, that's why they come up with these reports, because they have some information that they can share. Yes, Steve.
So a couple of comments. Number one, FINRA has long plans, and they've attempted on numerous occasions to be the SRO for RIAs. They're not there yet, but they definitely shown interest in that. On a separate comment, I find that sometimes if the employment agreements don't stipulate anti-compete or whatnot, if the people really don't like the PE or the investor or the new owner, then they're not going to stay. And with the clients, you can't make them stay either. Even if they're poach or not poach, some people say, hey, I'm with this guy, and if this guy leaves, I want to be with that guy. So it's not even a question of somebody trying to poach a client, although I think that's a consideration as well. I guess my question for Shelbie is, what do you offer as consideration for people to stay when they really don't want to, or whatnot, if that's not clearly spelled out in their employment agreement?
Yeah, so that's a risk that you have to take. And so to try to mitigate against that, you want to negotiate for an earnout that is achievable, even if you could stand to lose some and still achieve your earnout, right? Like, you've got to base the earnout on controllable metrics as much as possible, and then, you know, it's not 100%. So you want to just try to make sure that even if you've got some transition hiccups, that you can still try to achieve an earnout.
Yeah, and I think the other consideration is that people want to know that the new owner is going to be around for a while, that they're not going to just pull their money and have their RIA fold because they can't make it work. So, you know, that's going to make clients seem uneasy if they're not sure that they have confidence in the PE.
Yeah, and one of the other things that we're seeing is that one things that will happen is that, look, the CEO, we'll just give them that title, may want to move, may want to do something to, you know, engage in this type of planning, while they may have about a half a dozen people underneath them who have access to significant assets of the building, the billings and the clientele. And they may view this, nothing personal, you know, but they may view this as an opportunity for them to spread their wings and do something else. And there may not be a way to retain those people. That's something that you have to consider as you're like, that happened with a client of mine where, you know, they wanted to sort of transition, but they had a bunch of people that they thought were family, you know, and then all of a sudden, you know, one of the family members, one of the prodigal sons, decides that they want to do something else. They took a significant portion of the business.
And then isn't there a big risk with, especially if you're dealing with ultra high net worth, who everyone seems to want these days, it gets out that they're doing a sale and then your competitors are over. I mean, to me, that's huge. And then they're not only talking to possibly, if they know those clients, but also those employees before you have any kind of contract.
Sorry, I was going to say two things with respect to high net worth. I think that's why it's key that part of that buyers are going to want some sort of transition plan where the key players, key advisors are still there, you know, point of contact and their daily, you know, advisor. So the transition, there's always a transition plan. And in terms of retention of employees, you know, they're big payouts. They're, you know, folks that were making $200,000 and got $1.5 million bonus checks to stay. So, you know, if there's an investment advisor that is generating a solid income, I think buyers are willing to pay to keep talent.
I assume your firm represents buyers and sellers.
Yes, we do both.
So I worked in-house and I used to coach up our sales team as to when one of our competitors was making selling the firm, how our team might go get those clients.
Exactly.
And we had a lot of fun with that. We had a big board on the wall. We knew the names of the people, and I would just coach up the team about the tactics. Don't lie. Don't say Jerry was a bad employee, you know, just say you ought to leave the assets here, you know?
And that leads us into our next topic about what are the considerations that buyers and sellers should have, you know, when they're looking at this, when they're looking at these types of deals. Shelbie, you want to begin with that?
Yeah, so kind of some practical guidance for buyers is, you know, front load the compliance stuff, have a plan for assessing that from a diligence perspective, design earnouts that make sense, that are unlikely to end up with disputes in the end, base them on controllable metrics, avoid incentives that jeopardize fiduciary duties. And then, like Sahar said, an integration plan is key. Make a checklist, assign owners, timelines, KPIs across various, you know, sections of the business: compliance, operations, finance, IT, HR. And then, like we're talking about, make sure advisor compensation is very thoughtfully considered, since it's so important. Make sure your client outreach is warm and thoughtful, and coordinate with custodians. Make sure you've got a plan for data migration, which is also can be quite the effort. And then on the sell side, you know, come to the table ready, come to the table organized with your contracts, with your business information, your finance information ready to go to present to a buyer. If you come to the table ready and organized, you're going to be much more likely to get a better multiple. And, you know, present professionally build a deal team. These deals can take on, you know, it ends up being a full-time job just to manage the deal. And so while there's active business that needs to be done day to day, if you've got a dedicated deal team on the sell side ready to react to a buyer's diligence requests and negotiating the purchase agreement, those things are going to make the process a lot more smooth if you've got this sort of, you know, pre-thought as you approach the deal table.
And to add what Shelbie is saying, I'll start with the seller side. Please keep in mind that you got to get your house in order. And I know all of you have your house in order, but it's a good opportunity to review again because we could all improve. And making sure that everything is ready to go, your agreements, as Shelbie was saying, your manuals, your customer agreements are up to date. You know, everything is out there because having all of that in place mitigates the risk that a buyer is looking at when they're assessing how much they're going to pay. And as for the buyer, look, it's the questions that we've been getting, which is like how much are they going to pay? How much are they going to look at? And for a buyer has to look critically at the metrics of the seller, not just the financials, but the more like amorphous things, like, you know, like one of the great scenes in movie history was, especially for our field, was the movie Working Girl. Remember, with Melanie Griffith and Harrison Ford? It's towards the end of the movie when Melanie Griffith is like found out that she's only an assistant. You're not allowed to use the word secretary anymore. You know, only an assistant and, you know, not an investment banker. And she gets pulled into an elevator with one of the deal guys and Harrison Ford. And he asks her, okay, how did you come up with this transaction? He begins to say, and then they confront her boss, Sigourney Weaver, who, you know, has no idea, even though she was trying to take credit for the deal. And they fire Sigourney Weaver and they hire Melanie Griffith in true Hollywood fashion. But the point that I'm getting at is with buyers, you want to lock down. And part of that other like thing was that it was a radio transaction. They were buying radio stations. And the top radio guy, his contract was ending. And they decided that they had to lock in that contract. Those are the things the buyer has to ask about, you know, about those, not only about the money, not only about what the company is earning, but about the underlying aspects of that firm before making a legitimate offer. Look, last war story, I've had clients complain to me about, you know, their firm is doing gangbusters. They're bringing in all this revenue. You know, why are they getting these bad bids? Well, when you look at the underlying metrics of your firm, you've had some issues with some customers in the past. You've had some other points that have popped up. You know, you've had to take some charges and things like that, some settlements, some regulatory dings that went along the way. That's going to influence a buyer. Sarah?
I was going to say, and also just street cred, right? Like reputation, you know. So just keeping a clean and honest reputation goes a long way.
And yes.
Yeah, and other than Ernest showing his age there, I mean, they're going to ask you.
It's a classic. It's like everything else. You can watch it anytime.
Of course, and I'm sure you do. All that being said, I mean, down to the nitty-gritty, they're going to ask you your compliance manuals, all your manuals, and when they were last updated. You're going to want to see even your tax returns, because your manuals may be fine, but if you're going to lie to the IRS, well, that's a different story. So everything's got to sync, and asking for all your regulatory reports, inquiries, examinations, you know, special purpose exams, they're going to ask for all that. They're going to pick apart every aspect of that. So everything's got to be up to date. And, you know, what I do is I usually use an outside party to review manuals every few years, because A, you might not have the time to do it, and B, keeps Ernest in business, and C, they do a great job.
And
having the independent view is
right?
great.
There's regulatory changes all the time.
Yeah.
So, you know,
and no offense to Ernest here, but if they cite you after you've done this review, you can play the lawyer card and say,
Yep.
I was proactive, I went on the outside, I didn't take it. And then this thing will be less depending on the materiality of the item.
Yeah.
And you know.
There's nothing wrong with throwing the lawyer under the bus. I advise clients to do that all the time. Yes.
I was struck by your California example where that asset flipped several times, and then your question about things to look for. The one thing that I've found over the years that is often underappreciated is cultural alignment and this and your values. And I'm going to share an example very quickly.
Take your time.
Point estimate, you mentioned a PE. Another way to think about valuation is that multi-year period, that resiliency. If you have the cultural alignment, and it could be things like, I don't know, personal accountability, engagement, transparency, investors will pay a premium for predictability. So anyway, it was just I've seen so much M&A over the years, and I've seen asset write-downs, and then your California example it really resonated.
It's like the old expression, this isn't the old expression, the street loves nothing more than certainty.
And I was going to say, just in terms of, just alongside what you're saying, everybody who could stay, stayed because it was an awesome place to work, right? So, of course, not only are they compensated well, but it was just a great place, a great environment. So.
One of the last topics we want to talk about is, it's funny, the two big questions we always get are price and timeline. So Shelbie, when you're doing one of these deals, what do you tell people about timeline?
So typically a deal can take, I've seen deals take a year. I've seen deals take place in 30 to 60 days. I think the latter is more common, 60, 90 days. Usually you'll start with an LOI, a pretty high level summary of the key terms will show up. You'll decide as the seller whether or not you want it, sign it, and then the buyer will proceed into due diligence. Due diligence will take place for a while, and then at a certain point, the purchase agreement negotiations pick up while diligence trails off. The purchase agreement gets negotiated for a while, and as I mentioned before, a lot of these deals end up being a separate sign and close. So you'll have the purchase agreement signed, and then a period of time between signing and closing to deal with the client consent mechanics, mostly other things too, but that's sort of the primary driver. And then you'll close and then move into sort of the integration process, the earn-out period, which can take 2 years, 5 years. I've seen them all sorts of duration, but sort of the 2 to 5 year range is what I more typically see. And that's sort of the kind of beginning to end process as I see it, Ernie.
I have a question. I was just going to ask you, Shelbie, have you ever seen situations where the deals haven't gone through after the LOI is signed? And what are the more common reasons that deals have
on top of that
down?
You see breakage fees if the deal doesn't go through on top of that.
So the break fees I find less common, at least in the deals that I do, because they're on the smaller side most of the time. But the larger transactions may support a break fee. But typically, an LOI will get signed, and as you all know, those are non-binding. And so if the parties decide, the buyer decides, there's too much risk here, the compliance isn't what we want, the business case didn't prove out, then they'll abandon the transaction and delete all of the diligence materials collected and move on. But sometimes it's not just a diligence problem that causes the transaction not to go through. It's sort of the parties reach an impasse in negotiating the purchase agreement where the buyer is asking for things that the seller doesn't feel like they can deliver or are not palatable. From a purchase price and earnout perspective or from a governance perspective. A lot of these transactions, as we mentioned earlier, are the seller will retain ownership or either minority or majority. And so sometimes those governance negotiations are where things get tricky because an advisor doesn't really want to give up control or isn't able to, tolerate what the buyer or the PE is asking for as far as, governance control after closing.
And basically, there are times when, you may have had a great introduction, got to the LOI, but then as you're going through the process, you find out you really don't like each other. You're not going to be a good fit. And, that's why sometimes deals don't happen. It's not something that you can point your finger at and say, oh no, there's this underlying liability that we don't want, or you're being too cheap, you're not giving enough money. It's just that they find out, no, not for us. And so it sounds like in that situation, they kept selling it back. It just wasn't us.
Well, they just couldn't run it.
Yeah,
right?
they couldn't run it.
So the key is to, I guess, really know your clients well and become their, very close friends. And maybe you can just keep buying back your business for pennies. pretty remarkable story.
Yeah, and look, timing is like everything else. It's consistent with what we've been saying throughout the course of this talk and everything, that it's deal specific, and the more I will say one thing, it's been my experience, and some people may disagree with me on this, it's been my experience that the smaller the amount of assets under management that are being purchased seem to engender the more difficult set of negotiations. That's just been my experience. And meaning that, like, if you have, it's almost like if you have like $500 million under management, that's an easier negotiation than, like, say, $50 million. It's one of those things which pops up. I'm just letting you know about that.
It's
Why do you
also
think that
because,
is? I'm sorry.
I would think
I
that as the smaller firms have oftentimes that a lot of the things like we were talking about are calculated manually rather than, so it becomes a much, that's what I totally expect. Like, just like huge acquisitions like JP Morgan Chase.
Yeah.
They take a lot less time because they know exactly what they're looking for, and they immediately are like, this smells, goodbye.
No.
I think like the really small ones are much more complicated.
I think it's based on materiality, right? So like if a deal is huge, some active litigation is a drop in the bucket potentially. But for the smaller deals, everything is much more material. And so one issue could be a deal killer, whereas for a larger transaction, it's just sort of we'll deal with it later kind of thing.
I also think it goes to the culture aspects, the governance aspects that we've also been mentioning that also create that issue as well too. It's a little different when you're running your own shop in a smaller RIA and someone comes to you and says they want to do A, B, and C. It's more of a culture shock, and you have to be comfortable with that. I think that's what it comes down to too. On that note, we're going to move to closing remarks. And I'm going to do something different. I'm going to start with Sahir first. So what would you tell people, like buyers and sellers, like one thing,
I mean, I would say definitely, again, the same thing I just said for sellers. I think a lot of it comes down to just, really having those genuine relationships with your clients and your employees. That good faith really goes a long way when it comes to selling your business. And on the flip side, for buyers, I really think a lot of it comes down to compliance governance, at least from my perspective, because, an advisor that's very organized, very clean, has all their ducks in a row, follows a very specific compliance calendar, can show documents, for following all of the rules and regulations is a lot sexier than, something that's just a little bit disorganized, not as clean, not as transparent. So those are my two suggestions.
Shelbie?
Yeah, so I'd echo that too. Just, having great relationships with your clients and your employees is key. But as a seller, like I said before, show up organized, show up with your ducks in a row and understand what a buyer cares about. From the buyer side of things, I think integration is most important, and focusing on client retention efforts between signing and closing and after are critical for having a successful deal.
And I just to echo those comments and to put a fine point on it, it's like Boys and Girl Scouts, their mottos: be prepared, be prepared, be prepared. Always be available in terms of, getting things done. And the earlier you can get things done, the better. So with that, our panel comes to an end. And I just want to thank Shelbie and Sahir especially Sahir for jumping in like this. And Shelbie doing such an amazing job. She deserves it just for the travel issues, okay? It also comes to the end of our program as well too. We just want to thank everyone for being here today. Please stay in touch. Contact Sahir, Shelbie, Kimberly, Mark, everybody who was presenting today. They're more than happy to take your phone calls or your emails. Our contact information will be provided to you in an email thanking you for attending, along with the PowerPoint presentation. And we're here for you. We're here to help in this process. It's a slog, but we can work through it with you. Thank you again for attending. Appreciate it.